Hello, good morning, and good week to everybody. This is the second webinar on health technology assessment of medical devices that is organized in the framework of the Biomedical Engineering Program, Postgraduate Program at the University of Patras. And it is a great pleasure that today we have with us two invited speakers, Dr. Ernesto Iadanza, which is Associate Professor in the Department of Information Engineering, University of Florence, and also the actual Chairman of the Health Technology Assessment Division of IFMBE. And also Dr. Julie Polisena, Senior Epidemiologist in Canada, and co-opted member of the same Health Technology Assessment Division of IFMBE. The agenda of today is, after a short introduction of the speakers by myself, to have a description of the activities of the Health Technology Assessment Division of IFMBE by Ernesto Iadanza. That will be followed by a real lecture on the real-world evidence across health product life cycle by Julie Polisena. At the end, we're going to have a question and answers, and I would like to ask you to use the Q&A button at the top or at the bottom of your screen to put in written your questions so that Aris Dermitjakis will be able to repeat your questions later on at the end of the two presentations. Just let me know that Ernesto Iadanza let you know that Ernesto Iadanza is Associate Professor in Clinical Engineering and Research Fellow at the Department of Information Engineering at the University of Florence. He is currently, as I said, the Chairman of Health Technology Assessment Division Board and member of the International Federation of Medical and Biological Engineering Administrative Council. He is an IEEE senior member, and in year 2013, he received the IBM Faculty Award. Also in 2019, he received the IFMBE CED Teamwork Award. Ernesto is the immediate past chairman of the Clinical Engineering Division Board of IFMBE and also past chairman of the Education and Training Committee of the IUPESM, which is the International Union for Physical and Engineering Sciences in Medicine. Now, Julie Polisena is a senior epidemiologist in the Marketed Health Products Directorate at Health Canada. She has a Master of Science degree in Health Service Research from the University of Toronto, and she holds a doctorate in epidemiology from the University of Ottawa. Julie also completed a PhD fellowship in HTA at the Society for Medical Decision Making. Prior to joining Health Canada, she was a clinical research manager at the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. And initially, she was exposed to health technology assessment as a research assistant in Agostino Gemelli University Polyclinic in Rome. Julie also co-founded the Cochrane Rapid Review Methods Group and the International Collaborative for Medical Device Assessment. She is co-authored more than 35 publications in peer-reviewed journals. Now, I'm very happy to give the floor to Ernesto to introduce us on the activities of the Health Technology Assessment Division of IFMBE. Ernesto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. I will need to share my screen. I see that host disabled attendee screen sharing, so if there is any chance I can share the screen, please. Okay, now it goes. Thank you. Okay, here we go. So first thing first, I'm not associate professor, just to be precise. I'm adjunct professor in clinical engineering, University of Florence. You know, professors, they like to make distinctions, so it's worth to tell it. And well, I'm here representing IFMBE IFMBE is the acronym for the International Federation for Medical and Biological Engineering. Last year it was the 16th anniversary of IFMBE. It is the only worldwide federation of biomedical engineers, and our members are national societies in biomedical engineering and clinical engineering, as well as some transnational societies like EMBS, AME, and so forth, just to cite some. And let me just inform you that next year, hopefully, we will be all free and able to travel again. And what best occasion than going to Singapore at the end of May and beginning of June for the World Congress on Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering. Both the societies, IFMBE and IUPAS, every 3 years have their joint World Congress. That is a very, very big and interesting event. So hopefully I will see some of you there. IFMBE is also in charge of many publications. The IFMBE book series, every single conference that is IFMBE endorsed or sponsored has some proceedings, and those proceedings are collected in volumes that go together in the IFMBE book series, very well known and indexed, as well as the MBEC journal, which is the journal of IFMBE, and Health and Technology, that is the journal of IUPAS. So there are also many opportunities for reading or for publishing if you are authors. Well, there are just two divisions in IFMBE, many working groups and committees, but just two, let's call them operative branches, if you like. One is the Clinical Engineering Division, and the other one is the Health Technology Assessment Division, which I'm chairing since 2018 until 2021, because it's a 3-year term. And well, what's the WHO definition for HTA? I guess that in the first appointment you had last week, you already talked about this. So basically, what is it? It is the systematic evaluation of properties, effects, and or impacts to inform policy and decision making in healthcare, to allocate funds. And what's important is interdisciplinary groups using explicit analytical frameworks. And today, this is a very good example of the interdisciplinarity of the speakers, but also about how you can use explicit framework for the topic that Dr. Polisena will be touching today. What is the IFMBE HTAD strategy? We have our vision that biomedical engineers should be constantly involved in the assessment of medical devices, and to achieve that vision, we have our mission, so some enabling values encompassing know-how, multidisciplinarity, and interdisciplinarity. And we have 4 main focus areas: training, research, publications, and events. And of course, to achieve our goals, we have also many projects. For these 3 years, we have 12 different projects. I will not give you a brief description of each and every one of them, of course, because we don't have time for that. But you can see how many different topics we are trying to touch. And this list is not exhaustive. We are now dealing also with artificial intelligence in HTA. So how you can use artificial intelligence for assessing devices, but also how to assess devices that use artificial intelligence. And this is something we are now doing together with WHO, also in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. So this is a list of projects. If you want to go to our website, htad.ifmbe.org, you will find a better description of each project, also who is the team involved, who is doing what, and of course we are always searching for people who want to share part of their time for a worldwide community. This is just a picture, and I'm updating it every year more or less, and I think it's going to be 2 slides next time, because you see how the team is growing. And this is not just a list of names, people who are friends. These are actual members who are participating actively every single month, sometimes every single week, in one or more projects. So, and I'm very glad about this. That is, for me, maybe the first outcome, or the most important outcome. We created a community of biomedical engineers and people who are helping biomedical engineers understanding what can be done for HTA, and not just that, but also doing it. So doing projects. Sometimes we manage to meet in conferences. I just showed here a few events from last year, but we also meet virtually, and this is, of course, in this period is a common experience for everybody. But we started like 10 years ago. We started with Zoom virtual meetings, the same tool we are using today, or Skype, WhatsApp, and of course Meet, Teams, and whatever. We have an IFMBE HTAD Twitter channel, and we also use some project management online tools like Asana to manage the projects and the advancement of projects and the deliverables and the teams. So these kind of tools are very much useful for us. And of course we have a website, but we have also a dedicated e-learning platform which is growing faster and faster. And we also use YouTube. Today we are streaming on YouTube, for example, and we also use Vimeo, that is used for the HTAD e-learning platform videos. Talking about the e-training platform, again, that's the link to our website. Feel free to take a look there. And there is also a nice contact us button if you want to get in touch with us. So talking about e-training, we have a very nice dedicated platform, which is the effort of many years. This project started way before I was chairing the division. And there is a lot of material there, and it's well structured in courses. Let me underline that everything I'm talking about is completely free for everybody. Today is also open. One day I think we will regulate the access, but for now it's totally open for everybody. So this is just an example of the course grid you might find, and this might be one of the courses. You see, in this case, Introduction to HTA. You will find, in this case, 3 different lectures, and for each lecture you will have video material as well as handouts that have been prepared. So together with the slides that the teacher is using during his lesson, you will also find these handouts for each and every lesson in each and every course. So I think it's a very nice source of information for all of you. This was the WHO informal stakeholders meeting on HTA in Geneva last June 2019. It is very important to interact with other societies, because, you know, biomedical engineers, they do part of HTA, but HTA is a much broader field of knowledge. So it's very important that everybody does his part. And this kind of events are really, really very important and very useful. And we try as much as possible to keep our links with all the other societies. In this case, this was October 2019, the International Clinical Engineering and Health Technology Management Congress organized here in Rome, in Italy, and we had a very nice plenary session and roundtable that was very well attended. As you can see, most, if not all, the most important societies were there, not just the local Italian Society for HTA and the Ministry of Health, but also HDAI, ISPOR, MedTech, IUPASM and IFMBE, of course, INETA and WHO. So we are very well connected with all the HTA societies all over the world. So again, if you are interested in knowing more about the society, just you can email me, or if you like, you can take a look at our website, htad.ifmbe.org. And let me just try and show you very, very briefly, if I have one more minute. This is our website, so you will find all the latest news. This is today's event. And also you will find many information about the team, about the publications, about the projects I was mentioning before. This very nice page where you can know more, for example, about our collaboration with other institutions, who is doing what and how, and also the training platform that I was mentioning. So you can just click here, and as you can see, it's completely open, and you can start from wherever you like, and you will find, you know, lectures and video material and so forth. Thank you.
We thank you very much, Ernesto, for this very interesting tour on the activities of HTA division of IFMBE. I think that what happened during the last 6 years is really amazing at the level of the two divisions of IFMBE. The Health Technology Assessment Division has been really flourishing during this period, and thanks to your efforts, to Leandro, Pekia efforts, and also from the side of clinical engineering to Tom Jude, Yadin David, Khalil, and all these really big teams that are now really working very hardly to promote what biomedical and clinical engineers can do worldwide for the benefit of patients at the end.
Let me just remember everybody that we are building on your shoulders because you started it. So.
Oh, I'm becoming old now to be able also to follow all these activities. Are so many things that are happening, and together with what Adriana Velasquez is doing in WHO, this is really a period that it is fantastic for our let's say, community of biomedical engineers and clinical engineers. Thank you again very much, Ernesto. And now I would like to ask Julie to take over the floor, and just to remind to those of you that were not in the beginning that Julie Polisena is a senior epidemiologist at Health Canada, holds a master's degree in health service research from the University of Toronto, and doctorate in epidemiology from the University of Ottawa. I hope I didn't make any mistake.
No, perfect, thank you. So what I'm going to do is share the screen, and then I will start the presentation.
Yes, go on. Thank you for being here, although it is so early in Canada.
Like I said, for you, Nicholas, it's a pleasure. And thank you for the invitation. Okay, good morning, everyone. So as Nicholas mentioned, I'll be presenting on the real-world evidence across the health product life cycle. And all the references or the materials that I use to prepare this presentation can be found at the end. So they're all included, all the links, etc. So in terms of outline, we're just going to quickly go over, provide an overview of the definitions of real-world data and evidence, looking at how it's used in regulation and HTA. then describe a little bit about the concept of fit for purpose RWE. What are some of the biases and confounding issues related to real world evidence? As well as I wanted to present just an overview of some of the initial work that we're doing here in Canada related to the use of real world evidence for medical devices. And then finally, the optimizing the use of RWE in Canada. So it's become increasingly recognized that a wealth of real world data and evidence covering the medical device experience exists and is routinely collected in the course of treatments and management of patients. And these data, in addition with the use of randomized controlled trials, can provide some insights into the performance, safety, and clinical outcomes with the use of medical devices. So for this presentation, we're using the definitions that have been adapted from the Food and Drug Administration in the US, and they appear on the screen before you. So we would like to make a distinction between data and evidence. So real-world data is necessary, but is not sufficient for generating real-world evidence. And so real-world evidence also involves data management, validation, and standardization to make sure that the data are fit for purpose. So real-world evidence, so we're looking at the role of real-world evidence. It can provide estimates of effectiveness rather than efficacy in various clinical settings. And so efficacy, as many of you are aware, refers to the performance of an intervention or a health technology, but under very controlled and ideal circumstances. Whereas effectiveness refers to the performance of the intervention or health technology under real-world conditions. And so real-world evidence analysis can help to expedite the generation of hypotheses that sharpen the focus of clinical research, including the design of studies. And the use of real-world data sources can also help to expedite the recruitment of patients for clinical trials. So in terms of pre-regulatory approval of a health technology, real-world analysis can also augment the conventional clinical data with data from patients whose diversity reflects the real-world practice, resulting in better insight on the safe and effective use of health technologies. Whereas in the post-market world, the analysis of patient outcomes from the use of the health technologies in real-world settings can generate further insight on the safety and effectiveness. So for example, a real-world evidence generated from a long-term observational studies of patient outcomes can identify safety, effectiveness, and the personalization of care that can be difficult to observe in short-term clinical studies that are conducted among highly homogeneous groups. So real-world evidence exists and data exist across a wide spectrum. So they range from experimental studies such as pragmatic trials and observational studies to social media. Other data sources can include patient registries, healthcare databases, including electronic health or medical records, health insurance databases, and patient-generated data, which can be related to, for example, the use of smartphones or wearable devices. So some experimental and observational study designs can provide real-world evidence. So for experimental, pragmatic RCTs, population enrichment RCTs, cohort multiple randomized control trials, comprehensive cohort studies, clustered RCTs, etc., are part of the experimental study designs, which contributes to real-world evidence, the generation of real-world evidence. And then we have observational, which many of you will probably be familiar with. looking at cohort, case control, cross-sectional, controlled, and before and after case series, etc. So none of these study designs that I mentioned fit in the form of the traditional randomized control trials, which many of us are familiar with. Okay. So now, when we're looking at the patient-friendly real-world evidence, questions, excuse me. So for example, as mentioned previously, real-world evidence can play a role in designing the research question to enhance the efficiency of clinical trials. So for instance, it can be used to identify the most appropriate population for the study, the most valuable place in therapy, what would be the relevant comparators to represent standard care, and define the way in which the intervention is delivered in clinical practice, and understand which outcomes would be the most applicable to stakeholders, including patients. So what I presented here on the screen are just some questions that real-world evidence can help to address, that perhaps using evidence from or data from a randomized traditional randomized control trial may not be able to answer as well. So here is just a graph that, and again, it's even though it's coming from a journal related to an article on drug discovery, it could still be relevant. This figure is still relevant for the use of real-world evidence for medical devices. So as you can see, we have an array of stakeholders that each have their own needs and questions that they may have that range from, drug candidates, so, health technology candidate, either in the design or the testing of the technology, up until the market access. And in between we have the regulation to the market, and then the HTA, which relates to the payers component of the health technology. And then market access, some of the questions that the patient may ask is, understanding what are their choices, what is the safer treatment for them, etc. Okay, and here again, we have, I apologize, but I was unable to find a graph that was very specific to medical devices, but some of the components, even though this is related to drugs, can also be relevant to the life cycle phase of the medical device. Again, and so, I mentioned earlier that real world evidence can come from or be generated from, registries, hospital data, electronic health records, etc. And range, and it starts, from the life cycle, from the inception, which is the design of the technology, up until, going through market approval, post-market, the payer's perspective, and years that this technology is on the market. What is the impact on patient care? So when we're looking looking at real world evidence, obviously there are many benefits that are associated with their use. And there is quite a bit of interest, both by the public sectors, whether it be a regulator, etc., and private sectors to engage in the use of real world evidence. There is also a wealth of data that are being collected and monitored, not only here in North America, but also across Europe. And with increasing data availability, the prospect of using real world evidence in decision-making becomes one of the analyses and linkage rather than one of collection. So international stakeholder engagement will be important in moving forward with this issue. And the ability for forums to engage groups and provide lessons from multiple jurisdictions will be important in the further development of real-world evidence. So for example, we know that here in Canada, there are numerous forums in place that are actively looking to engage with the knowledge developed internationally. So I understand, like from my colleagues at Health Canada, I understand that they're on the drug side, they're in regular communication with the counterparts, the regulatory counterparts, both at the FDA as well as the EMA, discussing issues related to the use of real-world evidence and how they can further develop this field to help with the decision-making regulatory process. Now, in addition to, despite the benefits, obviously we must recognize that there are quite a few challenges related to the use of real-world evidence. So non-randomized studies do not meet the regulatory rigor of clinical trials, despite the availability of statistical methods to adjust for potential biases. Now, these study types need to be evaluated rigorously to identify sources of bias and confounding and adjusted for them before estimating impact of the interventions on health outcomes. As well, multiple data sources come from multiple institutions and multiple formats and may require data sharing agreements. And so there are some gaps and inconsistencies that can exist across the data sources. Another issue relates to the privacy and the security of patient data that could stifle the willingness of institutions to invest in real-world evidence applications, as well as if patients don't consent to the use of their data. Now, in that respect, at least for medical devices, one of the projects that I was involved with when I first started at Health Canada was interviewing various stakeholders, from industry to HTA producers, regulators, et cetera, both Canadian and internationally, about the uses and the experiences related to the use of medical devices. And a subset of stakeholders whom I interviewed were patients. And unanimously, the patients supported the use of sharing their de-identified or their anonymized medical information, as long as it relates to the advancement of, improving the interventions or care. But they were opposed, for obvious reasons, on sharing their de-identified or anonymized medical information for for-profit reasons, like for example, sharing them with insurance companies or industry. So, on the whole, patients seem to be quite okay with sharing their information as long as it's to advance the science within their particular disease area. As well, cost of generating and maintaining data sets from non-traditional sources remains uncertain. And researchers often have to clean real-world data since most of it is not collected for research purposes. And the potential impacts of real-world evidence, range from, as we saw along the product life cycle, can impact the regulatory decision-making, reimbursement decision-makings, because we've been using real-world evidence in HTAs for medical devices for years now, as well as the incorporation of real-world evidence to help develop guidelines. So now for regulatory purposes, real decision-making relies on clinical evidence, which traditionally comes from randomized controlled trials. And although evidence from other sources have been used to support decision-making, RCTs continue to remain the reference in terms of scientific quality. Consequently, evidence is required to authorize the marketing of a health product typically demands a clinical trial data. Now, although RCTs remain the gold standard because because of their design, which maximizes internal validity, one of the challenges with RCTs is the external validity. So the ability to generalize the conclusions of a trial to a more general and diverse population. As well, some of the other challenges that relate to RCTs that perhaps real-world evidence can address is the feasibility of evidence generation. So especially when it comes to medical devices, and even for some specific health issues, the conduct of clinical trials may not be feasible. As well, some trials may not be ethical, which affects the availability of crucial data. And some subgroups of the population, many subgroups, are often excluded from clinical trials. So the relevance of the outcomes becomes questionable. And then becomes the final point or challenges related to RCTs are that they can be costly, as well as it's very time consuming to design, conduct, and analyze the results, which questions or may hinder the timeliness of the results. So in the past couple of years, actually maybe now 2.5 years, the U.S. Drug Food Administration have put forth 2 documents related to the real-world evidence. So the document on the screen, on the left side of the screen, which is related to the drug program, was published in December 2018. And for medical devices, the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices was done in the summer of 2017. And so these are, they're not in the sense, they may not be as detailed as some, whether your industry, especially if your industry or, researchers, et cetera, may not be as detailed as what they would like it to. So for example, industry would be interested to know what are the thresholds, like what is the minimum threshold of data quality that are required for a submission to a regulator in terms of, when they're submitting their evidence for license approval, what are the minimum threshold? And unfortunately, these 2 documents do not provide that information, but that would be something that the FDA, as well as the Health Canada, for example, or the EMA, can further develop as they have a better understanding of what would be the minimum threshold in terms of data quality that is acceptable to the regulator. And as well, the threshold would be likely different for drugs versus medical devices for obvious reasons. So as I mentioned previously, real-world evidence has always underpinned HTA processes to an extent, because health technology assessments often rely on outcomes that are not always measured or available from a systematic review or a clinical trial. So this may include costs, patient-related outcomes, disease progression rates, as well as rare adverse events. Oh, this is just a list of organizations that currently accept real-world evidence. So I'm just going to skip over that, and now we're on to the clinical data slide. So where there is uncertainty in clinical data, real-world evidence can help to address the gaps. So for instance, real-world evidence can compare multiple alternative interventions or clinical strategies to inform the optimal therapy beyond placebo or sham comparators. As well, they can estimate the evolving risk-benefit profile of a new intervention, including long-term and rare clinical outcomes in a diverse study population that reflects the range of distribution of patients observed in clinical practice. And the use of RWE can also help to ensure an active surveillance and the detection of early safety signals and rare adverse events. So further, real-world evidence can also be available on a long-term horizon and in real time, thus potentially identifying trends in adverse events. And from an economic perspective, all the details are on the screen, real-world evidence can increase the certainty of inputs in a model and provide more accurate and precise estimates of both cost effectiveness and budget impact analyses. So this slide here is just an example that I wanted to share with you that occurred here in Canada. So Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories. And 2 of the provinces, Alberta and Ontario, each conducted separately a health technology assessment on the use of robotic assisted laparoscopic prostatectomy, or RALP. Now, what was interesting is that obviously both reports incorporated not only evidence from the published literature, but also local evidence or local data from their own jurisdictions. And as a result, the conclusions were different, as you can read on the screen, between Ontario and Alberta. So for example, the conclusions in Ontario felt that, this technology was not cost effective for, the specific patient population that they were studying. Whereas in Alberta, the conclusions of the use of RALP, or this robotic surgery, was way more favorable. And so, and part of the reason was because the data that were being used to, especially for in the economic evaluation component of the health technology assessment, they were using local data. And so when I just further, question why there were differences, and even speaking to a couple of stakeholders in each of the provinces, one of the differences that potentially could have impacted the results of, or the conclusions of each of the reports, is that in Alberta, this particular technology for this particular indication for prostate cancer was being used much more profusely, like it was being used more frequently. And so that allowed then the surgeon to acquire, perhaps become better skilled and more experienced with the technology, so which may have had an impact on the outcomes. So that's one potential theory. But again, it's just an example that, the use of local data, or, and in this case, I'm saying local data, but the use of real world evidence can potentially impact the conclusions of a particular technology for a specific population, just because it is very specific to that particular context. Okay, so in the next few slides, I am going to just go over these 4 concepts that are on the screen that can help to contribute to the HT advancement in real-world data and real-world evidence. So the first up, we're looking at equality and acceptability. So one of the first things to understand, and this applies not only to HTA, but it's also what kind of understanding, what is the relevance of real-world evidence? So what are some of the questions that RWE can help to answer? As well, as I mentioned previously, one of the challenges with real-world data is that there are many different sources that are being collected differently that are disconnected. And so, it would be great to have some common data models as well as minimum standards like quality standards, and ensure that there's transparency across the board of those who are involved in the RWD generation and analysis. And that's where collaboration with various organizations can help to create some of these linkages. Next, we move on to the governance and accountability. So again, good practice guidance on multi-stakeholder data ownership and management, understanding what data can be shared or can be common between both the HTA agencies and regulators, and perhaps even developing a global directory of accredited sources of real-world data that are accessible. And the development of an ethical framework as well can help with the accountability for collecting and using real-world data. Then we look at the transferability of real-world data. And so, some suggestions are to develop an international governance framework, and the development of real patient-related outcomes that can allow for replication of the study as well as cross-validation. Transferability will also be impacted by the data collection in the particular clinical practice, as well as the various real-world settings. And that was what I was hoping, or I'd hoped to illustrate in my previous example related to the robotic surgery for prostate cancer. So informed decision-making would be helpful or can be facilitated with the effective collaboration in the development and use of RWE, as well as what needs to be further developed is the capacity and methods to analyze and use real-world evidence, and instruct the technology developers on what data are needed to answer HTA questions. And again, that all also relates to the development of the health technology, the design of the study, what are some of the needs of the patients, the current gaps that perhaps this new technology can help to fulfill. So we're looking at the capacity of real-world evidence. It relates to the analysis component, so generating the use of real-world evidence, as well as receptive capacity. So how will the decision maker be able to interpret and put into practice the conclusions that are derived from real-world evidence? And then the data capacity. So this will include not only creating linkages across the various data sources, but also being able to clean the data, and work with it so that it can be useful, when it comes to researching or conducting further research on the specific health technology. So this is a nice little graph that illustrates the whole concept of real-world data. So real-world data sets should be evaluated as a fit for purpose on dimensions of data relevancy, and data quality for a potential regulatory decision or even an HTA recommendation within the context of a specific disease state or therapeutic area. So a real-world data set is relevant if it is robust and representative. So meaning it is the data are helping to address some of the gaps or information gaps that currently exist just with the use of RCTs. So data relevancy dimensions reflect whether a data set can address a regulatory or even an HTA question in a clinical context of interest that is outside the data quality assessment. And data quality dimensions characterize the accuracy, the completeness, and the transparency of real-world data. And it seeks to address potential information bias, which could impact the internal validity, as we mentioned earlier. So here's another graph. It just illustrates that when selecting one or more data sources, an investigator should show that the subset of data that they will use provides the relevant outcomes, exposures, and sufficient covariance to address specific regulatory or HTA questions at the required level of certainty. So in some instances, and this is where data capacity comes in, the study investigators may choose, may do some data collection, as a start for this process in terms of analyzing real-world evidence. But that would also involve them, having to do some cleaning, transforming the data set, like either developing a common data model, et cetera, and then trying to combine, if there are available, these data with other data sets where you can pool the results so you can have hopefully a more precise and accurate outcome measures. And again, this is just very similar to the previous graph, except that in some instances, the analysts may be working with an already existing data set that has already been aggregated and transformed by a third party, but still the same idea, concepts are relevant here in that, the data still need to be cleaned, verified, transformed, and potentially linked to other data sets in order to produce a fit for purpose real world data that could then hopefully be generated into real world evidence for analysis purposes. Okay, so this, I'm going to skip this slide just for an interest of time. And I'm going to move on to the potential limitations of real world data and evidence. So the risk of bias, as we know, estimates of relative treatment effects obtained from real world data sources are considered to be at high risk of bias because there is a lack of randomization from these sources. In some instances, it may also be difficult to obtain data, especially if it's individual patient data, because reported aggregated estimates on relative effects may be biased if non-optimal analysis methods have been used. And so when I talk about difficulties in obtaining data, as we all know, many of the data, real world data and evidence or data that are being collected for medical devices tend to occur at the institutional level. So whether they be in many instances at a healthcare facility or a hospital, for example. And so sometimes, there are some proprietary rights that come into play to obtain these data. So that's where some of the challenges may also occur, is the accessibility of the data. As well, the reliability of results can also, be a concern, especially if the data quality has not been vetted for. And in some instances, there's more data cleanup, more sophisticated analyses that need to be done in order to analyze the real world evidence or data and evidence to come up with a robust conclusion. And some of these data or evidence, especially when it comes to doing some of the analysis, we're talking about the Bayesian statistics, et cetera, they also rely on expert opinion, those are some of the challenges when analyzing real world data and evidence. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the internal versus external validity since we've covered that in the previous slides. So I'm just going to go, I apologize, into strengthening the use of, okay, hold on, let me go back. So I just want to quickly highlight an initiative that has been ongoing here at Health Canada. And as many of you may be aware, so Health Canada is the regulator for both drugs and non-drug technologies here in Canada. So it is part of the, Ministry of Health here at the federal level, so the national level. And so one of the projects that has been underway for at least 2-3 years now is the regulatory review for drugs and devices, which is R2D2 for short. And the project was initiated to help strengthen the use of real-world evidence throughout the health product life cycle. And the outcomes, the hope is that there will be more timely and appropriate access to health products for Canadians, as well as to produce a more proactive health product surveillance model, which is related to the post-market, that can then help to enhance the regulatory options. And for this project, for both, because it's split into two, for drugs is one project and then medical devices is a second project, we also have incorporated as partners the involvement of our HTA organizations here in Canada. So HTA, so we have the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, which operates at the pan-Canadian level. And then some of our provinces, about 4 provinces here in Canada, also have HTA agencies. And so they're also involved in our initiative related to strengthening the use for real-world evidence. So, as I mentioned previously, Health Canada is committed to strengthening the use of medical devices, and it aims, and this project, the R2D2 project that I alluded to earlier, aims to optimize the consideration of real-world evidence across the medical device lifecycle. And a similar, as I mentioned, parallel project is also underway for drugs. And so the key goal of these projects is to work with partners, or HTA partners, to develop a systematic and transparent approach to the use of real-world evidence across the device lifecycle. And the second objective of the project is to strengthen the use of RWE to support regulatory decision-making throughout the medical device lifecycle. And so as we work to modernize our procedures, the overall objectives will be to optimize patient outcomes by better responding to healthcare needs. So in March 2020, which would have been a little over 2 months ago, Health Canada did produce a strategy, a real-world evidence strategy that was done in collaboration with our HTA partners here in Canada, that outlines the key activities that will be undertaken, in the upcoming months, etc., to optimize the use of real-world evidence across the medical life cycle. So not only for regulatory decisions, but also for HTA recommendations. And so the plan describes the actions, which are seen on the screen here, and the outputs required to achieve the objectives. And so what I'm going to do is just quickly review some of the 4 actions that are outlined in the next few slides. And so the first action is to, for Health Canada and our HTA partners, to develop core action teams, or to create core action teams. And so these are action teams which will help to define what are carry out activities in the action plan, facilitate collaborations and discussions among various stakeholders. So right now, for medical devices, a core action team has not been established yet. But this group, which is going to be made up of regulators, as well as HTA producers, community members, industry, etc., will help to set the tone or guidance on what are some of the areas that the project teams should be focusing on as we move forward with the project. The second is the development of an RW. So the second action or activity, as outlined in the real world evidence strategy, is to develop a framework. So framework is just, they're going to be along the project lifecycle, guiding principles on what are the specific regulatory and HTA recommendations for which real world evidence may be a reasonable, acceptable, or maybe even a preferred data source. And so, so the core action team can be looked at the who, so who are the people who are going to be involved and what's going to be involved, or the who, and then the framework would be focusing more on the what. So where and the where can would RWE along the project life cycle be of the greatest benefit, whether it be for regulatory decision or developing an HTA recommendation. And then the next, the third activity, which is also very important, is looking at the guidance documents. So the how. So there probably won't be just one guidance document, but there'll be several guidance documents. There may be a guidance document specific to, the reviewers within Health Canada on how to assess, submissions that come into from industry who are looking for a license to market their medical device, their new medical device or health technology. So it's looking at trying to, identify, if the data meet specific a certain threshold, whether the analysis was sound. So how to appraise the real world evidence. And so these will be more detailed, the guidance documents, and it will only be, the guidance documents will only start to be developed after a framework has been established. And, there's no point in developing something from scratch in some instances. So if we can see that, there are existing guidance documents that are available that have been developed internationally, then, we can leverage and build on some of those existing guidance documents. And the fourth activity is looking at the implementation strategies. So once we have developed a framework and then the guidance documents, the idea is then to develop and define implementation strategies that will put into action both the principles described in the framework as well as the guidance documents. And so, again, this would involve education and outreach activities among stakeholders that can include regulators, industry, as well as clinical and communities, patient advocacy groups, research institutions, and academia. And so that will also help to ensure that these documents or these framework and guidance documents are being used and followed, and that will also help to create some coherence and consistency across the various stakeholders. Okay, so this here, optimizing, so this, yes, I'm going to skip this slide because this relates to drugs specifically, but you can look at it, and this document was posted on the Health Canada website, which is in 2019 last year, And basically, it was a notice to industry on the drug side, though, that that acknowledges that Health Canada does accept real-world evidence to inform regulatory decisions. So it's a bit tricky, because even though a framework on the drug side has not been developed and there aren't any guidance documents, the industry has been allowed to to submit their applications for a license with the to include real-world evidence. And so I'm not sure exactly what the status is in terms of, because I'm more involved on the medical devices component of regulation. But I imagine there are some challenges that the reviewers are facing at Health Canada on understanding what how are they supposed to assess and evaluate the relevance and the quality of the real-world evidence. And again, this is just another document that was posted on the Health Canada website, and it was a very general document, that provides some guidance on elements that should be addressed in the protocol development of a study that includes the use of real-world data and evidence. Okay. So optimizing the use of real-world evidence in Canada. So as I mentioned, there needs to be some alignment between the policymakers or decision makers and researchers. Definitely, we would need to consider data governance, access, and privacy legislation. Stakeholder engagement, we are doing that, and it'll be crucial to continue as we work through this project or this initiative. And some of the challenges, especially when it comes to medical devices, will be the interoperability and interpretation of real-world data findings, which also includes one of the challenges, the availability of data and specialized resources. And one of the challenges too is right now there doesn't seem to be a universally accepted definition for real-world data. Right now, Health Canada has adapted the definition of real-world data based on the FDA, but who knows if that'll change in the future. So this slide is just to, these are some of the some of the organizations here in Canada that already are, that are publicly based. So they are, they're not private organizations that already are collecting real-world data and have been for a while. And some are very specific to, drug policies, and others tend to be a little bit more general, like related to health services, research in general, et cetera. But it can be relevant, especially, some of these data when you're conducting a cost-effectiveness analysis in an HTA. So I just have a few more slides, and then I think we'll be done here. Okay, so one of the projects that I worked on at Health Canada was looking at the, and this was an environmental scan that was conducted to identify the existing and planned sources of real-world data in Canada for the use of medical devices. As well, a second component to this environmental scan was understanding the stakeholder and patient experiences and perceptions related to the use of medical device, related to the use of real-world evidence for medical devices. And so I'm just going to highlight, and what you see on the screen is a figure that illustrates the main findings of this environmental scan. And so the key findings that were derived centered on the regulatory leadership, stakeholder engagement and partnerships, patient engagement, data collection, quality and analysis, and then the application of real-world evidence. And so the idea is this environmental scan, the results of this environmental scan which the highlights are posted on the Health Canada website, which you'll see at the end of the presentation in the reference section, will help, the results of the scan will help to develop our real-world evidence framework for the medical devices for both, that will be done both by Health Canada as well as our HTA partners, and then subsequently the guidance documents. So to enhance the use of the full potential of RWE, again, some of these suggestions that have been both in the literature and even in speaking with various stakeholders, some recommendations include the standardization of common data models. And I know this is being done on the drug side. When you look at the FDA Sentinel network, et cetera, and so there is some work on that, but on the drug side, continue to collect longitudinal patient data, especially when it comes to the post-market impact of the surveillance of the medical devices. Check the internal validity of the data collected, because so there will be some data cleaning that will have to be done, and curation of the data, et cetera, so that it is in a workable format that can be used for analysis. And as well, developing appropriate and legal and regulatory frameworks. And so when we talk about legal, in part, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at data privacy, data sharing, et cetera. All that stuff needs to be considered. Moving forward, again, continuation is, continue to have early dialogue with relevant stakeholders. And this is even going as far back as, when you're at the design or of the health technology, like what are some of the needs that need to be addressed, and what are some of the understanding, what are the more relevant outcomes, patient outcomes that need to be collected, ensuring high quality and the integration of various data sources, and developing not only statistical methods, but more also developing a capacity to apply these statistical methods when you are analyzing real world data and then generating into evidence. And then finally, and I know there's some work that's being done on this, is the incorporation of unique device identifiers, which I understand the US has some pilot form for some of the implantable devices. And as well in Alberta here, one of our provinces in Canada, they also have their own version of unique device identifiers, but that's something that obviously moving forward, we will need to put more energy and hopefully resources to come up with a consistent approach. And moving forward, yes, okay. So publicly funded infrastructure for data collection and analysis, definitely. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the activities that we will be doing as part of the strategy, as outlined in the strategy, is looking at the guidelines on the use of real world data and evidence, and then focusing on the data for patient care rather than data pricing, and then just continue to collaborate with various HTA partners, as well as continued involvement with the stakeholder engagement. Just not only to get their different perspectives and understanding what their needs are, but it also helps to have their buy-in if they feel they have contributed to some of the decisions that have been made, which will then help to influence the uptake of the use of real-world evidence, not only for regulatory decisions, but also HTA recommendations. And that's pretty much my my presentation. It's just, there are some common challenges for many jurisdictions, and one of them is finding the appropriate balance between assessing the safety, efficacy, and effectiveness of the health technology, but also allowing rapid access to patients. And real-world evidence is increasingly being recognized as a valuable source to support informed decision-making. So in many instances, especially when it comes to medical devices, clinical trials may not be available, may be difficult to execute unethical, or may lack an understanding of the device implications on patient management in a real-life setting. So hopefully, the intent is that real-world evidence can monitor variations in the safety and effectiveness over time, which also accounts for the accounting for the learning curve and across the different users with multi-research study designs. And that's it. And here are my references that I've included in the back. And so I'm going to stop the screen sharing. And I think we have a couple of questions, or I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, Julie. It was very interesting presentation, and I see now that the daylight,
yes, it's
back on the window. And with this occasion,
yes.
reminds me that you wake up very early at 4 o'clock today in the morning. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. Before coming to the questions from the participants, I would like to ask you, you gave a very good example for the robotic system, demonstrating that the effectiveness of the medical devices depend a lot on how these devices are used, the training of the users, and all these things that you mentioned in your conclusion. The question is, from my side, how the stakeholders, how the industry, the manufacturers will be engaged and will participate in sharing their own data concerning their devices with other groups like researchers, authorities, etc. And I'm saying that even data that are related to vigilance purposes in Europe are not available widely. There are very much a lot of restrictions, in contrary with FDA, that I always repeat that even the user reports on vigilance are available. How do you think that they will see their own interest to share their own data?
And that's one of the questions, again, and that's where I think, and this is just me speaking from my perspective, because yes, it is difficult to obtain data, especially proprietary data. And this is not necessarily just, industry not wanting to share their data, but also data from public sources is also a challenge. And especially as I alluded to in my the talk in the earlier slides, is that many of the data for medical devices are being collected at the hospital level. And so many of them are not necessarily, they're more reluctant to share the data, and in part, for, patient identity, they want to protect the patient identity, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the challenges is also obtaining patient consent. And so that's, so some different models are being questioned, like maybe it should be an opt-out model, meaning that if you're collecting data, based on the use of a particular technology, then automatically the patient will be opted in, but then, so that would be the starting, but only if they choose to opt out, will they be excluded from the data set. So in terms of accessing, that's a good question. And I would think in part there has to be some discussions and it's not just industry, but also with researchers and academic organizations, as well as clinical societies and regulators, et cetera, developing almost like an understanding and some sort of, not almost like a framework in terms of what are, or an MOU, like what is, what type of data can be shared and for what purposes. So there has to be because I think when we start these dialogues on a regular basis, the guard will be let down a bit more, so people will be more willing to share information as long as you understand the other parties' perspectives.
Okay.
So I'm not sure, but this is just my opinion based on my experience when I was interviewing the various stakeholders for the environmental scan that I discussed in the presentation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think now Aris Dermitzakis will take over to present the questions.
Okay.
Yes, we have two questions. One is from one of our students in the BME postgraduate course. It's Panagiotis Koukoutsidis, who is asking, is there a specific patient group, like saying oncology patient, let's say, that provided health services have been really ameliorated by RWE in terms of health provision before and after the applied use of RWE?
So for that one, I don't have the answer on hand. Like in terms of specific patient groups. And again, I would have to look at various examples and this would be more for drugs, because as I mentioned earlier, for medical devices, both in regulation, for regulatory decisions, as well as in HTA recommendations, RWE has already been used and is currently being used, and it has been used in the past. And mainly the reason is that, the requirements to obtain a license, at least here in Canada, and I know the same in the US and in Europe, are different from the requirements to obtain a license for a drug to be able to market their product in the jurisdiction. And so already we're starting with we have a different starting point. And so many of the submissions that are sent to a regulator from industry that includes an application for a medical device license, many of them for medical devices will not include randomized controlled trials, but will be based more on non-randomized studies. Non-randomized studies are as well, in some instances, data that are routinely collected, but not necessarily for study purposes. So there may be, I understand, like at Health Canada, for some of the drug device applications, they also receive case studies or case series and from industry. And the industry is expecting the regulators to make decisions whether to approve or not approve, or approve with condition for a specific device, just based on a case study or case series. So, so to answer your question, I don't have a specific, answer. And also, when you're looking on the drug side, in many instances, when you're looking for patients with rare diseases, because of the, the small study population, these particular patient groups would rely on real-world evidence, or evidence that fall outside of data or outcomes from an RCT, because in many instances, an RCT is not feasible. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think that you have covered the question thoroughly. So there is one more question from Dr. Zoe Kolitsi, who is saying that while it is clear that your focus is on regulation and HTA, can you kindly advise whether and how your Canadian RWE framework addresses the needs of medical device industry players in a sense of supporting innovation, for example, AI-powered technologies, and policies for boosting competitiveness, developing markets, etc.?
Okay, so so while our project is mainly focused on real-world evidence for general devices, and again, we still have to specify, because we are still in the early phases of the project, one of the questions has arisen, at least at Health Canada, with our HTA partners, is whether, as we move forward with this project, whether we're going to focus on specific classes of technology to start with, so whether it be the more, the implantable devices, or whether we want to focus more on, technologies or drugs, medical devices that focus on a specific clinical area. So for example, cardiovascular, they heavily rely on the use of medical devices to treat their patients. So again, that's still being ironed out. In terms of whether we're going to provide some guidance to industry, well, that's where we're hoping the guidance documents will help to address some of their needs. And this will be in general, and again, that's a good question. Right now, the scope for the guidance documents is looking at, as we're addressing the industry needs, is what is the minimum standard? Like what do we consider to be a data quality that's acceptable in order for Health Canada to review your application for a medical device license. So focus is more on the data quality. But there are other initiatives at Health Canada that are currently underway or have just begun, related to, that are more specific to the use, providing some guidance to industry on cybersecurity, as well as artificial intelligence and machine learning. So for example, the WHO now, which is a group that I've just joined, in terms of, they started a working group on trying to develop a regulatory framework for the use of artificial intelligence. And so that may help to answer some of the questions that industry will have, as they're developing their technology or designing technology, but then also seeking market approval.
Okay, we don't have another question right now. I don't know if someone from the attendees want to write a question at the chat, but right now we have covered all of them.
Probably the time is exactly 1 o'clock, and if there is no other question, we must close. Ernesto, you want something?
No, just to let you all know that together with Julie and Martina Andelini, who is participating today, I've seen her name in the list of the attendees, and Pier Giorgio Salerno, we are preparing and hopefully very soon submitting an article that gives you a nice point of view about how technology can help you in accessing real-world evidence and real-world data. And I'm linking now to the question about how can you obtain this data, which are not very simple to access, as you were underlined as well. And well, we are trying to leverage on techniques that come from other domains, like the sentiment analysis, or also linked data, open data, semantic web. So there's a whole new bunch of technologies that are very well used in other domains, like in commercials or like in politics, that we are trying to exploit to understand how we can access this unstructured data and link them together and extract information from the real world that could be used as evidence for HTA. So, and this is one of the projects that I showed initially from the Health Technology Assessment Division of IFMBE. So it is funded by IFMBE, and all the members are have some role in HTAD.
So stay tuned. We're hoping, Ernesto, maybe in the summer we'll have something to submit.
In the summer.
Or soon,
or sooner. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Ernesto. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you.
Hopefully, to add,
informative.
Thank you again very much for participating in this webinar. I also want to thank Aris Dermidjakis for his support, and of course Kaliroi Stavrianou that coordinated all this webinar again. And I hope that all the participants enjoy these two presentations, and they are going to be on the YouTube quite soon, and so many others could see them and take the knowledge of real-world data and the activities of the division. Thank you again very much. Keep safe.
Thank you.
And
You too.
see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
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 Bye.